my name's Chris Cutland and I'm Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner. I still have to think about it, for Nottinghamshire. And I'm just going to say a very brief bit about the role and then I'm going to tell you why I'm talking about domestic violence. The Police and Crime Commissioners were all elected in November, and I might have passed, quite a few people passed by because there wasn't a huge turnout. However, in this area, Paddy Tipping, who became elected, had one of the biggest numbers of people turning out for him to be elected. And Police and Crime Commissioners are about a different way of making the police in particular accountable. So there was another way of making the police accountable before. There was something called police authority, but the government didn't like that and they opted for an elected person for the police to be accountable for. So what happens is the budget for the police come into us, it's a bit scary, and we set the police and crime plan, very exciting title, but it's not just about the police, it's about the way people work together to make sure that we keep crime as low as we possibly can, make sure victims' needs are right in the heart of what we're doing. And Paddy appointed me as his deputy. I work 3 days a week, I don't work full time. And the reason I was appointed by his deputy is I've got a very different background from lots of other people. I've had a lot of experience of working with the police because I used to be Chief Executive of a charity for domestic violence victims. I've had experience of working in local authorities. I've worked with Nottingham City Council, and I think he also thought it was really, really important that 50% of the population were represented, that women were represented as well. So sees that as being very important. I have continued, and one of the reasons I'm really keen on this job is it's because it's continued my passion for making sure that victims of domestic violence, families who experience domestic violence, are absolutely at the forefront of people's thinking. It's a really big hidden crime, and you'll know from maybe the media stuff this week about Nigella Lawson. Horrendous stuff. But what it shows is domestic violence can happen to anybody. So I'm going to do a little bit of a quiz. Is that okay with you all? You can just shout out the answers. Some of them you'll probably know, and we can have a bit of discussion. If you don't believe them, tell me you don't believe them. If you say, how do you know that, ask away. It's not just about, it's a two-way conversation. So the definition of domestic violence has changed lately. The government have changed it. So it is still about physical, emotional, sexual, financial, I've got the fifth one in a minute, abuse in an intimate relationship. But the age group has been lowered. Used to be before, we didn't consider domestic violence was affecting anybody before the age of 18. Well, that's now been reduced to 16, and I think some of the most horrendous statistics are actually with very young people, even younger, who experience some sort of abuse with their boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever. So that's just to give you the background. So I'm just going to ask these questions and just shout out the answers I'm thinking of, and we'll have a bit of a discuss. So, according to the latest research figures, how many women do you think will experience domestic abuse at some point in their lives? Have you got any thoughts on that? 1 in 4. 1 in 4. Any advance on 1 in 4? 1 in 4 is the official figure. 1 in 3, depending on what area you live in, so that's at some point in their lives. In any room of women, every 10th woman is experiencing domestic abuse of some description now. Now, we won't always know who they are. It's still considered to be extremely shameful. Women always blame themselves. Children always blame themselves. But I don't know, do you think that's a shocking statistic? Are you? Shocking statistic. This is not something that's been plucked out of the air, this is years of research. Internationally, it's 1 in 4, so the World Health Organization have also done huge amounts of research internationally. For some women in different parts of the country, in different parts of the world, they'll experience it differently, but it's 1 in 4. So, next question. This is all cheerful stuff. In Britain, a woman is likely to be killed by her partner or ex-partner. I give you multiple choice questions. Every 3 days, 3 weeks, or 3 months. What do you think? A woman's killed by her partner every 3 days, 3 weeks, or 3 months.
3 days. 3 months.
So we've got 3 days, 3 months,
3 days.
3 weeks. We've got them all. Okay, it's actually 3 days. There's a woman killed in this country by her partner or ex-partner every 3 days. In Nottinghamshire, I think in the last 18 months, we've had something like 4 women murdered through domestic violence. Some of them will have hit the press, some of them might not have hit the press. At least one of them, her young child, was present. It's a shocking statistic. Well, I think it's a shocking statistic. People think it's a shocking statistic. It's not something that's publicised an awful lot, and I'll talk a bit more about it. Well, actually, I'll do that bit now. I'll do this. So, how many times do you think women will have tried to leave, will have left before they finally leave, if they ever leave? What do you think the average might be? Do you think it's 3 times? 4 times? 7 times. On average, women will leave 7 times before they finally leave, if they ever leave at all. And it takes 7 times, because if you think about it, you might have a row, there might be nothing, it might be absolutely not too bad. You'll say, I'm going, we might go and stay with our mothers. He'll come round with a box of chocolates, say it's never going to happen again, you go back. Next time something else happens, it gets slightly worse. You might be pregnant by then. You leave, you might go and stay with a mate, he comes round with a bunch of flowers, says it's never going to happen again, you go back, you've now got a baby. Something happens again, you're abused in some kind of way, you leave, you go and stay at your mates with the baby. The mate now has a baby of her own. She says, I can't do this again because it keeps coming round and harassing. So you go back. You have another child. You leave again. Your options about where you go become smaller. You might phone up a helpline. You might go to a refuge. You go to a refuge, sorting your money out is an absolute nightmare. You don't know what to do, you don't know how to turn, you might have had to move city to be safe. There's contact made again. He says he's never going to do it again. So you go back again. You might do the same a few times. You might still love him. On a good day, things can be really, really good. For once, things can be really, really good. But eventually something so awful happens that you decide that's the time you've got to go. And there are other ways to leave nowadays. You don't have to go into refuge. And we've got somebody who maybe can talk a bit more about that later. You can leave, you can have something called sanctuary put in. You can have injunctions. There are different ways of leaving. And nobody's going to blame you if you want to stay. Nobody's going to blame you. It's very, very hard. And what really upset me about the Nigel Lawson thing in the papers this week is one of the papers apparently said, don't buy her books if she doesn't leave him. There is shows absolutely no understanding of how hard it is to leave and move on. The shame that woman must be feeling now. The humiliation. Publicly humiliated. Not her fault, but I found it absolutely gobsmacking, to use a technical term. Women who leave their abusers are more or less at risk of further violence from their ex-partner. So we've talked about the leaving and things. Do you think they're more or less at risk if they actually leave? More or less. So actually, one of the triggers for really serious domestic abuse is when the woman decides to leave. So she decides to leave, and he gets, he understands what's going on, and she leaves, and he will try and prevent that leaving. So there will be quite often really awful things happening to prevent her leaving. The other time where there's a key time of particular danger is when she's left for 3 months, because he quite often thinks, oh, she's going to come back, she's going to come back, she's going to come back, she's going to come back. Get to 3 months, she doesn't come back, so he goes looking. She thinks, he's not found me, he's not found me, he's not found me. Her guard relaxes. The children by this time will be really fed up because they've left behind their children, the members of the family, sometimes pets. There's more risk of her being found. That's not to say she shouldn't leave, it means that those that are supporting around her are more vigilant, so she might be found and something might happen then. How much does domestic violence cost the country per year? Do you think it's 1 billion, 100 billion or 23 billion? Sorry?
1 billion.
1 billion? Any other takers?
23. Take the middle ground.
Good. Okay, it is 23 billion. Okay, that is a huge amount of money. So those that aren't convinced by that we need to actually put help into women experiencing domestic violence, when you tell them the money, they can see it makes sense. So that's ambulances, doctors, police, solicitors, specialist care. Children quite often end in care, so it's the whole total amount of domestic violence across this country. It's an absolutely jaw-dropping amount. Better to know that we're preventing it. On average, how many times do you think a female survivor of domestic violence is assaulted before she seeks external help? Is it 7 times, 23 times, or 35 times? 35. 35. So we've talked about the shame. We've talked about he'll change. We've talked about it's my fault. So you go through all that, and eventually you just have to tell someone. Sometimes it's the police. Health visitors and midwives should now be trained up. It's called asking the question, to say, it's a very difficult question to ask. Are you experiencing domestic violence? Is someone hurting you? So we're hoping that that figure is coming down a bit, but it takes an awful lot of time. You know, people have got hope. People have got hope that things will change. Okay, an incident of domestic violence is reported to the police every minute, every 5 minutes, or every hour. It's every minute. On average, every minute. And one of the things that's happened in Nottinghamshire, because I think the police in Nottinghamshire are pretty good around domestic violence, because there's been a lot of specialist domestic violence help, the number of women reporting, well, the number of people reporting domestic violence has actually gone up. And people look at the crime statistics and go, oh, domestic violence figures are going up. Well, the reporting's going up, which is good, which is great, because it means that women now have confidence, mainly in the police to call, have confidence in other organisations that they're going to get supported. So we don't believe there's an increase in domestic violence. What we believe is that there's an increase in actual reporting. What percentage of domestic violence is reported to the police? it's 40%, 25%, 75%. It's actually 40, which is, not bad. That means 60% aren't reporting it at all. 60% of women are living, 60%, not of women, but 60% of those experiencing domestic abuse aren't reporting it. Alright, I'm doing a quiz.
I've done it before.
You did it before, you'll know the answers then, that's good.
Yes, I did. I went to England before.
Okay. So 40%, I think that's not bad. I'd like to see it a lot more, because the minute you report to the police, people are made aware of you and your lives are at risk. Domestic violence abusers who abuse their partners are also likely to abuse their children. Is that true or false? It varies, but on the whole, it's true. Perpetrators of domestic violence have usually come from domestic violence backgrounds. Is that true or false? Really interested in this. We don't know. We don't think so. It's a choice. It's a choice. You choose. So you think, I was having a conversation at the table a few minutes ago where we were talking about what our parents said and did and all the rest of it. And when people make choices, they think, I am never going to do that, like my mum and dad did. Or, actually, look what my dad got, because, all he had to do was shout. Because in the end, quite often, violence doesn't have to be used at all. It can be a sign. People live in fear. It can be a sign. Or, there are other ways of controlling. So, it's not necessarily, don't assume that because you know somebody that's an abuser of domestic violence that they come from a domestic violence background. It's not always true. I usually stick this one in. Perpetrators of domestic violence use pets as a means to control families. Is that true or false? What used to be thought was that if you had somebody that was abusing somebody in the family, this is the old school of thinking, was that you had an abuser that abused somebody else in the family in the family would abuse somebody else, and it went down to the dog. That's not true anymore. We realise that's not true anymore. You've got an abuser in the family, they're quite often abusing everybody in that family, including pets. And one of the things that stops families from leaving, and especially sometimes children, is the fact that they've got to leave their pets behind. Quite often, wherever you go, whether it's a refuge or a relative's house or whatever, the pets can't go as well. And that's very, very upsetting for the children in particular, because it's just something else that they've got to give up. But quite often the pets are being abused as well, or being used in some kind of way, so it just makes it all really difficult. Abuse rarely happens in pregnancy. Is that true or false? Yeah, it does happen. It's one of the triggers. Okay, and this is how we know domestic abuse is about control. Okay, so if you think about a pregnant woman, so you would have been abused in some kind of way before you get pregnant, but for a lot of women, once they get pregnant, that is the actual trigger for violence. And we know it's controlled violence. So if you have two people fighting outside a pub on a Saturday night, you think about them flailing their arms about. They hit everywhere, don't they? They hit absolutely everywhere. In domestic abuse, not just when you're pregnant, what we know is quite often women get hit from there to there. Now, that has to be controlled. You can't just hit, it has to be absolutely, you have to be in control to do that. And domestic violence is one of the causes of fetal death syndrome. So it's one of the very scary things. I'm cheering you all up here like that. What percentage of domestic violence incidents are witnessed by children? Is it 20 to 35%, 30 to 65% or 75 to 90%. It's the top one. And I would say every woman I've ever worked with thinks she's done her best to protect the children. Quite often they're sent to their bedrooms when there's an absolute... What you learn to control if you're in a domestic violence situation, you learn to read the atmosphere. You know something's going to happen. You can tell. And quite often the kids are sent to the bedrooms. But the kids know what's going on. They hear what's going on. Quite often they do witness what's going on. Sometimes they get in the middle of what's going on and get cut themselves. And sometimes, in the worst cases, they're trained up to be part of the abuse as well. So if you've ever been in nurseries where you've got a kid who's swearing at somebody and kicking and saying the most awful things, you know that that's come from somebody. So I have cheered you all up, no end. But when I worked for Women's Aid this time around 7 years, and I worked for the organisation when I was much younger as well. But what I find is that people do come through this, and they come through a heck of a lot stronger. I think the last presentation you had said, sometimes out of adversity, not the right words, comes strength. And for those who do make it through, they come out a heck of a lot stronger. They come out different people, but they need support to do that. So, if you know anybody that's experiencing domestic violence, please encourage them to report it either to the police, to phone the confidential 24-hour helpline, to get help as soon as possible, because the longer families experiencing domestic violence, the longer it takes to recover from the damage that's done.
It's not always physical, is it?
It's not always physical, it's financial, sexual, all sorts of ways. That's why we changed it to abuse. It's all about control. The violence is at the end, and quite often it peaks. It peaks in certain age groups, and then wears off because violence no longer has to be used to control. So, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. That talk was very interesting and informative. Before anybody notices, my hemline's dropped. Try pinning it up. The pins were sticking in my knees, so I took them back out again, so I'm just going to go for it. We had Carolyn before with her heel, me with my hemline dropped. Okay, what Chris has had to say is very salutary, but it is happening all the time. As a family law specialist and work that I've always done, I've dealt a lot with domestic abuse cases, particularly in the past. I've trained at one point as a specialist in dealing with domestic abuse cases, and I also now have dealings with the local Women's Aid. It is something that's very important to me. What I do know is that it affects people in all walks of life, particularly. What Chris touched upon is something that people don't always fully appreciate, and that is that domestic violence is no longer just violence, and it changed its name to abuse for a reason, because it's not just actual hitting somebody, whether it's physical, whether it's sexual, or even threats to be physically violent. Abuse takes different forms, and as Chris mentioned, what people don't always think about is the emotional abuse or the psychological abuse or economic financial abuse that can also occur. It is all about control. It is about sometimes a situation whereby you can be criticised constantly, mocked, accused. It's a way of getting control of somebody, or using pressure tactics, threatening to take the children away, threatening to commit suicide if certain things don't actually happen. Isolating people, stopping people from making telephone calls, telling you where you can and where you can't go, or stopping you from seeing your friends and relatives. It's all part of that controlling behaviour, which people don't always consider as a form of abuse. Disrespect, even putting you down in front of people all the time, in front of relatives, in front of friends, making you feel very small and not very big at all, or just simply refusing to acknowledge you as a person, that you've got views, that you're being listened to, that not responding, or even refusing to assist, for example, with things like the children and doing the housework. These can all, maybe surprisingly, be forms of abuse. On an economic situation, trying to control somebody's money, withholding money, taking away your purse, even doing things like preventing you being able to use a car to go where you want to go, and having no choice in decisions. So it can take many forms, and none of us would ever consider entering a relationship knowing that you're going to be abused. You don't put yourself in that situation, but often it's something, and as Chris touched upon, you possibly love that person, you accept them for who they are, they may have changed over time, and it does take a lot to actually do something about it. I will briefly touch on the legal side, because there are things that you can do. I'm not going to go into any detail. Just as important to report matters to the police. When somebody does make that decision to do something about it, what is essential that they have support in place from a legal perspective, that they've got that backup and they can do something about it. So, the position is that the law is there to provide help by way of injunctions, by orders, removing somebody from the home, by giving you personal protection, by removing you away from that situation altogether, and there are refuges, etc. Available in order to do that. In the same way that we don't expect abuse, we don't expect relationships to fail either. The whole point about what I want to talk about is not just about abuse. It's about the fact that what we don't know is what our life holds for us. But to some extent, we can plan for some of the things that might happen to us. I'm a bit of a film buff, I like films. Forrest Gump is a film that I've watched once or twice. And as he was told by his mama, apparently, life is a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. We don't hold crystal balls. We aren't Doctor Who. We don't have a TARDIS. We can jump in and transport ourselves to the future and find out what is going to happen. I like science fiction as well as films, and I used to watch a programme called The Tomorrow People. I don't know if anybody is of an age where they remember that. It was a programme about teenagers, and I was always very envious. They had jaunting belts, and whenever they wanted to, they could use these belts and just get themselves out of situations and move on, and they could communicate by way of telepathy. The thing is, this is the real world, and it isn't science fiction. So what we have to do is look at our situation and then decide what we can do and what we can put in place in order to try and help ourselves in the best way that we can in these situations that occur. The thing is, everybody here today is here probably because they've got some involvement with a business. But at the same time, also probably got personal relationships. Now, whether that's a husband, a wife, a partner, may have children, there is some sort of family situation. And you could run your business completely on your own. You could run it with your partner or husband. The situation is that basically what you're looking at here is continuity for your businesses in the event that something untoward might happen. Because you probably draw an income from your business. It's what you live on. What happens if things go completely wrong? You may have capital assets which you need to draw on if required. You might have an interest in a business which you want to pass on to your children or sell or deal with. And the question is, have all of you thought about if things went a little awry, what would happen to those things? How would you live? What income would you live on? Our lives are constantly changing. It may be that events arise which we don't know are going to happen. Drawing on what Chris has said, it could be a situation whereby, although it's not something that we want to do, we end up having to leave our home. We have to relocate, we have to get out of a dangerous situation. It may be that we become ill for some reason. We might be diagnosed with cancer. We might have an accident, and it might mean that you can't work either temporarily or on a permanent basis. The relationship that you have got with a partner may break down. Where does that leave you? You might get into debt. You might have a dispute with a partner. Eventually, we're all going to die. But there could be good things that happen in your life as well. They're all the bad things, really. There are good things too. You could receive an inheritance, you could win some money, you could have got rid of one relationship but starting a new one. Good things. You might be buying a new home, you might be starting a new enterprise, starting up a new business, something that you're really enjoying looking forward to. When would you speak to a solicitor, really, if those circumstances arise? Well, the situation is you all ought to speak to a solicitor at some point. We're not just there for the bad things. We're not just there in the emergency situations to deal with the crises in life. We're also there when you're starting out in doing things. When you're starting up a business, thinking about how you want to run your business, and planning and talking about things right from the outset, getting them set up on a legal basis, ensures that what you're doing is eventually getting your desired outcome from what you want to do. Discussing matters with a solicitor, you can look at the whole range of the legal aspects, how you're going to set up the business in the first place, the financing of it, whether you're going to remortgage a family home, all the implications of doing that, because sometimes we press on and we do things without always thinking through fully the consequences of our actions. If we're starting in a new relationship, we might want to think about, if we're moving in together, what it is that, again, we want out of that. Lots of people these days don't stay together forever. They have second or even subsequent relationships. Some have a series of relationships, but they're all committed relationships and they all end up living together. There are often children and children from different relationships, and it's about looking at the situation and protecting both the assets perhaps that you have and also the children and what their future is going to hold for them. You could be looking at getting engaged or married, again something nice that you're looking forward to. The situation is that with all of these things, that whatever life holds, you should be thinking about what might happen if things go wrong. Now that's a really horrible way of putting it, really, and it's almost back to front. You're almost anticipating that something goes wrong. But actually planning for what you're doing can actually help. You might be in the middle of your business, but you might want to be looking at developing that, changing it in some way for the better. The point in all of this is that there are a wide range of circumstances that happen in all our lives that we don't necessarily cater for, that we haven't thought about, but it is possible to plan for in the event that things do go wrong. If you don't make plans, again, it's all the doom and gloom side of things, really, but ultimately somebody else may be making decisions about your lives. about what you do. If you can't talk and you can't agree things, somebody else is going to decide that for you. It is generally much more costly to sort matters out after a dispute, after the event, than it is to actually start thinking about things early on. If you don't make plans and things go wrong, it can be a time of uncertainty, stress, anxiety. You're in limbo. People say the worst thing about not knowing what's happening is the fact that they don't know what's happening. It causes the most stress and anxiety, not the actual event that happens, not the actual leaving the home, not the actual change of income or lessening of income. It's not knowing where you're going to be several months down the line. And if you've already thought about that and you've already planned it and you've already looked at entering a written agreement, then you're almost going to know what that situation is. Or a good part of it anyway, because you've been in control of what's been going on. People do worry about raising concerns and wishes at the beginning of a relationship or partway through a relationship, because basically they think everything is going to rock the boat. If you start talking about things, well, this is what I would like to happen if things went wrong, then actually they say, whoa, what are you talking about this for? But actually it's a very sensible thing to do. You can talk in terms of a written agreement. At the beginning of relationships is the best time to do it, because you can completely plan what you're going to do with the business, depending on the nature of the business, shareholders agreements, partnership agreements, members agreements. On a personal basis, living together agreements, prenuptial agreements, but you can also have them after the event as well, and they are still as effective. Communication is really the key. For me, communication is one of the most important things. If people don't talk to each other, then that's where everything starts to fail, whether you're at the beginning of a relationship, in the middle of it, or at the end. And again, I felt it very important during my career to undertake further training to actually assist people in communicating. We don't want to rely on those tomorrow people communicating by telepathy, because actually silence breeds misunderstanding often. You may think that you know what that other person wants and what they want to do, but actually if they don't say so, then it's often where misunderstandings start. And once you've got misunderstandings, that's when you get into dispute, basically. So if there are going to be difficulties, it's best to iron them out as early on as is possible. The law is there really to provide protection, to provide certainty, and helps you to be in charge of your own destiny. If anybody is in any doubt about their situations, what is happening now in their personal lives, in their business lives, what might happen in the event that their circumstances change, what might happen on death, then they need to ask. They need to look at taking some action now, because it's actually never too late to start planning your future. So what I really wanted to get that message across today is we don't know what's going to happen. Events arise in all sorts of circumstances which are out of our control. But if we look at what we can do to plan those things as far as we can, we retain some control over what happens in our lives. Because if we don't plan it, nobody else is going to. What I just want you to think about today is what's happening in your lives. Do you have things in place as to what might happen, both during your lifetime and on death? And is there anything that you could maybe be doing differently? Do you have a comprehensive strategy in place to deal with whatever life throws at you. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you.